Hi everyone, welcome to my talk. Good afternoon, good morning, whichever time this is being broadcast. My talk is titled More, Why the Most Resilient Companies Want More Incidents. My name's John Egan. I'm CEO and co-founder at Kintaba. We're an incident management product company that makes it easier for companies of any size to practice incident management within their organization in what we consider to be a simpler and more successful manner. Before that, I built tools at Facebook as the company scaled from about 4,000 to 20,000 people, both internal tools as well as helped to build the external tool Facebook Workplace, which is Facebook's public enterprise offering. I have a real passion for incidents. It's a space that I think is one of the most fascinating areas inside of our industry in terms of the way that we approach them, as well as how we're starting to adapt the way that we record them and react to them within organizations, primarily in tech, and how we're absorbing a lot of the best practices from other industries. So today I'm going to get into some of the maybe more controversial ideas around how we might want to track incidents. You can see in my title, we're going to talk a lot about why more incidents are better. And we'll get to dive into a couple of examples and further than that. So let's get started. First of all, everyone hates incidents. Let's be honest about it. Maybe you have a person or a team internally that likes incidents, but I imagine on average across your organization, most people don't respond to incidents being excited. Most people will generally hear about an incident or be involved in an incident and have a reaction, something more similar to what we have with Grumpy Cat here in terms of just trying to make it stop. And I think that's a natural human reaction to have to, things that are perceived as bad, right? Things that are putting our company at risk, oftentimes by definition. In fact, with most incidents, our first exposure to them tends to be an incident so large that we're drawn into it despite maybe even being on the periphery of it. So by definition, our first experience with an incident at most companies tends to be a negative one. But this actually has some practical effects on organizations and the way they approach incidents that isn't so great, I think, and that I think we're going to talk a little bit about countering in this talk. I call these the I hate incident metrics. And this is the way a lot of organizations we talk to are currently measuring incidents and thinking about incident management. They're thinking about mean time to recovery, mean time to failure, mean time between failures, MTTR, mean time to MTTR, the other one, mean time to recovery and repair, as well as resolution, the other one. And you sort of get this acronym soup of mean times. And there's a bunch of reasons these aren't great. I actually have a whole other talk specifically about what I'm not a big fan of when it comes to these metrics. But if you want to boil it all down to sort of the 30-second answer of why these aren't the best metrics when you're building your incident management system, it's because ultimately these are sort of vanity metrics. They're metrics that are pretty easily gameable. They're metrics that we can go in and make negative decisions about or bad decisions for our company that ultimately produce better looking metrics. So for example, trying to push mean times down, a natural reaction is to file incidents later, or maybe not file incidents at all. Another example of these in general is we're encouraging people to work towards an average across a series of black swan events, which is what major incidents should be. And because of that, we're actually ending up with a number that isn't particularly representative of any of the individual incidents that we're having. So not a big fan of these in general. And the way I like to think about this when I talk to people about, how are you thinking about your incident management system? Why is more better? Why aren't we just measuring how to reduce as much of this stuff as possible? I like to back up and think a little bit more about the goals that we have within our companies when we're thinking about resilience. And our goal is that it's resiliency. It's not just recovery. Being able to recover is important, and it's something that our teams should be capable of. But it's not really the primary thing that we care about long term, is it? What we actually care about inside of companies is long-term resiliency that ultimately results in a reduction of catastrophe, not just incidents overall. And so when I sort of want to back into this problem from that first principles of what we're trying to accomplish, it's easiest to sort of look out at industry and say, okay, well, who's actually good at this? who's good at being resilient and what are they doing that's great? Like, what are the things that they're measuring kind of at a top level, macro level that makes them really successful? And whenever I talk about, industries that are good at resilience, anyone from within the resilience space, resilience engineering or otherwise, always gets kind of on the tip of their tongue the same industry, and that's the airline industry. So this is an industry that over the last about 12 years has carried more than 8 billion passengers without a single fatal crash. The airline industry really is what we call the crucible inside of which modern incident management grew. We inherited almost everything that we now know inside of technology organizations when it comes to incident management and response, modern incident management response from the airline industry. So I think looking at them really closely is an important method when it comes to trying to determine, what's the right way to become more resilient overall. What are the right metrics to be tracking? And I think a lot of people don't realize that when you're looking at this industry, you really actually want to look at recent history. Despite the fact that a lot of the discoveries in human factors, blame-free processes, et cetera, were kind of built out in the 50s and 60s originally from an academic standpoint, what really happened is after a series of major crashes in the 80s and early 90s, the industry made a top-level change. They came out and said, we're going to increase the overall reporting of incidents within our organization aggressively, and we're going to make those incidents as available as possible to everyone else in the industry. We're going to make a concerted effort because we think our process is good. We think our method of learning is good, but we just don't have enough of these things happening because people are ultimately sort of afraid to file them. So more incidents. This has really kind of ended up being the answer. The organization pressed hard and had an order of magnitude of incident filings and reportings. And out of that came the modern industry we know today, which is what we consider to be the safest mode of transport. Another sort of adjacent industry that we can look at for starting to understand, maybe some of these metrics of more is better might be the space industry, which is sort of a sister of the aviation industry. And in the space industry, they faced a different problem entirely, which was they saw what was working well for the airline industry in general and said, great, we need more incidents. But we don't fly these things that often, and we don't want to have to collect all of our incidents on each flight. We need to find another way to get more. So organizations like NASA actually reach out and find incidents across industries that aren't theirs, or inside of organizations that aren't theirs. And then they absorb those incidents as if they were their own, and they write NASA postmortems about them. I thought this was so cool to discover. NASA actually maintains a website where they track case studies of incidents happening outside of NASA, and they write up lessons learned, underlying causes. They talk about them as if NASA had been the one who caused the incident. And it was really, really fascinating to me to see. And it's this great indicator of just how critical it is to go and have enough incidents happening inside of your company, that they would do this. They would go out and find incidents elsewhere. Luckily, most of us don't really have to do this, right? Luckily, most of us can sort of look at these initial learnings from these two industries, and we can say, all right, we need more incidents. And it's not actually a problem within our organization that we don't have enough. It turns out that what we're not doing is we're not recording them. And then you ask, why aren't we recording these incidents that are happening inside of the company when we know that there's a benefit to getting more incidents into the system? And I think there's some very simple steps that we all need to take in general. But I think this is all just beginning to happen across especially medium-sized organizations in the tech world, as well as smaller organizations. But even large companies are sort of pushing through this. And the biggest one is really this first one, which is how do we lower that barrier to reporting? How do we increase our number of SEV2s, our SEV3s, our near misses, right? Netflix was really at the front of this, right? The forefront of this. How do we log every near miss? And how do we make sure that we learn from it? We don't just log it and sort of know that it happened. But the immediate action that has to be taken is get them logged, get them recorded, because they're happening in your company every day. And the way you do that, the way you get that barrier lower and for people to react to that lower barrier, is the second item, which is you have to simplify the reporting system and process inside of the company overall. You can't have this big mega reporting process of multiple pages of documentation that you have to follow, meetings you have to show up at, terrifying reviews with managers and people up and down the reporting chain. You've got to make it dirt simple to come out of the gate and say, okay, a thing happened. Let's get it logged. Let's get it recorded. Let's get it put into the system, and let's make sure we learn from it quickly. And then finally, we have to show through actions the results of those reports. We have to make sure that people can see the changes happening in the company as a result of those incidents being filed. And you can do that two ways. And I think the easiest way to understand those two is to sort of look at this quote from Charles Billings, who was the chief of aviation safety research at NASA, which was this realization that the reason they're able to get people to file these incidents, pilots and unions that were originally kind of against the idea of more filings, is they had a sincere interest in improving safety, which I think is true across our industry as well. I think most people working inside of tech companies have a desire to reduce the number of major catastrophes. But number two is actually the more important one, which is a sincere belief that what they're reporting is going to be used to make things better, not just used against them. This is pretty critical. If you don't establish that culture, then you won't get more. And if you don't get more, then you won't be able to increase anything about the ability of your process to function. So I wish I could just sort of end the talk there. Wish we could have a 10-minute presentation and say, great, okay, more incidents reported means fewer catastrophes. Therefore, we just need to make this chart happen within our company, and we're good to go. Increase in overall incidents recorded, decrease in Sev 1 major outages. Like, hooray, it's going to work. Like, sadly, that's not really the case. I think it's not quite that simple. And when we say more, we don't just mean more incidents. We mean a lot of things. And we can kind of prove this out by taking another, life critical industry. We can take the healthcare industry, which tried to do exactly what I'm talking about today. They tried to take these learnings from the airline industry and from NASA and say, great, what we've got to do is we've got to get these incident numbers up. We've got to get everyone recording. And so there was a concerted effort really across most hospital systems and healthcare systems, nationalized or otherwise, to increase overall reporting. And after this had happened and been going on for a couple of years, there were studies that were run. And on the upside, we found that with those incident reports increasing, that litigation claims per bed seemed to be negatively correlated, which made the lawyers happy. However, the hospitals turned out to be pushing back a lot harder than originally expected in terms of actually filing the reports. And they were both afraid to file them because they were worried it would make them look less effective in a competitive environment. And they were concerned that it would bring additional regulatory attention to them, and that these reports of incidents would be used as ways for governments and regulatory agencies to file fines, as opposed to being used primarily to make safety better, as it was being done effectively in the airline industry. And then, worse than that, it turned out that there wasn't really an apparent association between these reporting rates going up, where the industry pushed to get people comfortable with filing at all, and eventually got those filing numbers up. You didn't actually get a positive correlation between that and the mortality ratios. So this is pretty concerning, right? Your whole goal, as stated by the beginning of this presentation, is you need to report more incidents. And I wish I could just say that's the thing you can take away from this entire conversation, but you actually need to take this warning away as well, which is that it's not just about having more incidents. And we can go back to Charles Billings again here, same guy from NASA who went on to actually help the healthcare industry go and try and work through this challenge of how do we implement these solutions. And his response was, okay, it turns out that the only takeaway anyone got from us trying to push this in was that they just needed to report the incidents. And through reporting, that would be enough to fix all problems, that the fixes would just be generated magically out of nowhere. And then that would enhance safety overall. And sadly, it's not true. There's a whole process here, right, that I think we're all aware of with incident management. And I think this process becomes critical for more incidents mattering, because an incident needs to actually kick off an entire flow of response to the incident, the resolution itself, and then importantly, the reflection on the incident and the learning about the incident and the distribution of that information. So how do you make sure that when an incident happens, that it actually gets reviewed and that you actually change the way your company runs based on it? Well, it turns out it's not really just about more incidents, right? It's really about more learning. It's about that outcome, and the learning doesn't happen automatically. The learning actually takes a pretty concerted effort in and of itself. And I think we sort of all in the industry have an understanding of what it means to try and learn from the really big failures. We're able to look at them and say, okay, there's been a major outage. We need to go and write a big report on this. Let's get 10 pages written with every root cause and every contributing factor and every impacted person. Let's bring everyone in a room and make sure we read it. But when you're thinking about a world where you want to maximize the amount of learning, you actually have to think about two other things. You've got to think about simplifying that process for creating learning documents and then greatly increasing the distribution of the information. And I think the easiest way to sort of think about doing that is to actually go and make your postmortems as public as possible. A couple of these things in parentheses, because the organizations that are the best at this actually do that. If you go to NASA's website, they actually have a learning center where they've got over 800 postmortems written up, which is just all of the things that they've learned over time. Google publishes their postmortems publicly, generally, I think partially because the public demands it. But I think ultimately it's turned into a really powerful process for them to make sure that they write consumable accounts of what happened that can be consumed by anyone in industry, and ideally people even outside of it. Cloudflare does the same, Amazon does the same. Like, writing these things up and publishing them as publicly as possible turns out to be almost the thing that's more important, but is really kind of a follow-on effect of having written more incidents. Is you have that process in place. So we write more incidents, we follow that process, we aggressively publish those postmortems out publicly, we write those postmortems in ways that they can be consumed, even if that means writing them simpler. And our takeaways change a little bit from just being write more incidents, make more incidents happen, over to this world of, okay, we need to make it easier to file the incidents, we need to make it safer to file those incidents, we need to simplify the process so that you're writing more postmortems, so you don't feel afraid of going into this gigantic and terrifying template that maybe you don't want to fill out, or you don't want to distribute, or you don't want to have to go and research. And then we have to distribute those learnings out to as many people as possible within the organization, so that they all read it. So when we talk about more, we're really talking about all of this stuff, and the trigger for all of this working is to file more incidents and to get comfortable with the idea that you sort of want to see a metric there increase. You want to see an increase in incidents being filed in your organization. That's a positive thing. And you're not really quite so concerned about, for example, the amount of time between incidents. You, if anything, you want that to decrease. You want more of these things being filed. And if you do that, then you have an opportunity to be kicking off a process, which hopefully is well-defined in your organization. Personal plug, if it's not, come check out Kintaba. And when you have that well-defined process, you'll be writing up these learnings quickly to follow up the incident that happened, no matter how small it was. You'll make sure to come in and write. I have a blog post called the 4-second postmortem, which is all about writing one sentence in the simplest case. But even in the slightly more complex case, you might come in and write a half-page postmortem or a quick paragraph on changes we need to make. And then finally, you have to have a concerted effort to distribute those learnings out to more people within the organization. Just putting it into a Google Drive is not enough. Emails need to be sent. Sites internally need to be maintained that potentially carry all of this. There need to be events, and there need to be meetings, and there needs to be a part of your culture within the organization that says we care about reading these things, we talk about them after they're read, and we distribute them widely across the organization, not just within the SRE team. We distribute them everywhere, such that the whole organization can learn and improve our resiliency as we go forward. And I think if you do all of those things, if you focus mostly on increasing your practice of incident management, as opposed to just focusing on decreasing the here and now of the active incident, you'll get a lot closer, I think, to putting this guy up on the moon. And I think that's really kind of what we're all thinking about when we're practicing incident response, is moving our thoughts from that grumpy cat of how do I get this to never happen, like to stop, to what practices and processes do I put in place to make sure that this doesn't happen again in a catastrophic way. So that's my talk about having more incidents and more reporting and more learning, and why more is better, and why the most resilient companies in the world practice finding as many incidents as they can within and without their organizations. So thank you for your time. Excited to talk through the Q&A and talk a little bit more deeply about your personal experiences with this. And thanks again. I wanted to thank everyone for coming to my talk. Hope it was a useful conversation. I see there were some good questions in the chat channel that I could probably address here while we're waiting for the more formal Q&A to kick off. There was a question here from Justin about writing easily consumable postmortems being time consuming as well as difficult to do. And I just scroll here to that question's chat interface is a little bit difficult. And is not always easy and time consuming. So who in the org do you suggest author the postmortem? I think really one of my points here in this conversation about lowering the barrier in general is that you should have sort of a spectrum of different types of postmortems that are being written. For simple incidents that you're maybe capturing down on sort of the Sev3 level, maybe the near miss, you might not have to have a multi-page complex technical response. You can probably have a little bit more of a straightforward, immediate takeaways, things that you would learn if you were in person, maybe even in a hallway walking past someone and saying, oh, we need to never configure things that way again. We need to never, roll our scripts kind of serially or in parallel. So I think, that's kind of a longer conversation within the organization. But when you're lowering that barrier, you really want to focus on how do we make like the easiest postmortems easy, so that folks who would otherwise write them and contribute some piece of information back as a learning to the company don't shy away from it out of fear of sort of a multi-page complex document that has to be put together. Hi, Tammy.
Hey there, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I lost my buttons to turn on the mic and the camera. But yeah, I'm here now. Thank you so much, John. That was awesome. We're really excited to have you open up the track today. Loved your talk. It was really great, full of so many interesting, insightful findings as well. And so one of the things I was wondering about too is you had some really interesting information about NASA, how they write up postmortems for incidents that aren't even from NASA. How did you find that out? And did you find out anything else interesting when you were looking into this?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a ton of time just trying to dig into postmortems, and I always do this. I'm a bit of a postmortem junkie, and there's some resources online with them, but there aren't really too many exhaustive ones. So it's a lot of Google searching, it's a lot of rat holing around, what companies seem to be doing it, and then finding it. And the NASA documents are actually on what used to be, I think, an employee only page that was opened up more broadly. And unfortunately, I actually just tried to share the link to it, and I think they might have locked it back down over the last week or so. So I'm going to poke around and see if maybe they've just moved it to that lessons learned site, because I can't imagine they would intentionally try to hide those. They're super valuable. But I'd never seen companies doing that before. NASA is really the first time I'd seen an organization, follow on so aggressively to the idea of we've got to have more of these reports, because that's the only way we learn, but we don't necessarily want to generate them, through rocket launches or through things that put human life at risk. I think the closest thing we have to that in the tech industry is probably, what maybe the chaos engineering space, where it's like, let's generate these incidents, let's just make them happen, right? So that we can get more of these learnings. It's still direct from within your organization, but I think, when game days are run well within organizations to try and produce other incidents, they often don't look like the things that affect necessarily our infrastructure, right? They might look like take down a third party, take down a data center because of a sandstorm. And I think that's maybe close to it, but I'd love to see more companies sharing how would we have interpreted this outage inside of our company, and what would the learnings be here, versus necessarily waiting for it to happen to them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I love that idea of maybe everyone, say to a few companies, let's all write a postmortem for this specific incident or inject this specific failure and see how we handle it, like one type of third party going down. That's really interesting. So another question that came in the chat is that there's a correlation between an increase in observability and incidents being reported, right? So should a tech team focus on better observability over introducing new processes? What's your thoughts there?
So I responded quickly in the chat, but I think in general, these things all kind of produce outcomes that lead towards this general goal of how do we get more of these incidents filed. And they capture different types of incidents, right? So it actually turns out at most companies, the vast majority of incidents are filed by humans. It tends to be a human decision to say, okay, these observability metrics or general trailing metrics or otherwise are actually valid to the point that we need to go and address them directly. And I think what observability does really well is it causes accountability towards things that ought to be incidents very quickly, because you have public availability of the information. And if you have more humans seeing that data, it's more likely one of them is going to make that call that we need to go and declare an incident, versus trying to sweep it under the rug or hide it. And then I think on the other side of that, you've got incidents that, the worst incidents often are ones that you don't have any visibility into, where the indications of it are customer, inbound support requests or a conversation happening in the hallway about a near miss that's about to go on. And I think you've got to attack it from both angles. And it's one of the reasons I really think, kind of up-leveling when you're talking about metrics away from just, how quickly are we responding once the incident happens, up-leveling that out to say, no, we're really just doing whatever we can to get the incident count up. And I do think it has you look at tools like observability, and it also has you look at the human factors of how do we change that culture and simplify that process so we're not afraid to file, or avoiding, which is even worse, filing incidents because we don't want those numbers to go up.
Yep, definitely. An interesting comment in the chat too in regards to the number of incidents that you report is just a comment here. It says from I think Simone, I think that more traditional companies worry about customers' perception about the number of incidents. So what's your thought there if you do have to report these to customers?
So I think once there's certainly that sort of that moment of change within a company, from going from we don't really talk about these things to we talk about these things. And I think if you're going to be public, which is the ideal situation about the increase in incidents that are happening, I think you should be public about that adjustment of practice as well, towards the statement of we're going to start being public about it. We're going to start being more talk more about it in a way that you're going to hear from us. And I think what's important there is to be really clear about your delineation between, major, minor, near miss learnings. And I think NASA is a great way to point back to, right? NASA calls these things learnings first and foremost, right? That's what the goal is. And I think if you phrase it externally that way, the public is much more accepting of it. You talk about, here are our learnings from this past month. Here are our learnings as a company from this past year. And it's just a different attitude, I think, to take towards it, versus here are the things that are going badly, right? Here are the things that aren't working. And that shift, I think, has to happen both internally as well as externally. And I think we're seeing larger companies doing that more. Just not just because they have to talk about them, but because I think that it actually garners them a growth in community from the technical space. Cloudflare's done a pretty good job of this, of being public when they have trouble, even before it's publicly, reported. But other companies, I think, that do it as well, I just think benefit from it. And historically, they've only talked about them inside of maybe their technical communities. And the more open we get about that, the more we're going to be able to both be internally more aggressive about reporting as well as externally.
Yes, definitely. And so that's an interesting idea as well, to be able to share our incidents. And you mentioned in the chat that, you do think it's improved over the last few years. But how do you think we can really, blow that open and just see a lot more public postmortems being reported from the tech industry? Because, maybe in the end, NASA would be looking at our postmortems to learn more. That would be pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, these things, these sort of cultural changes that happen across organizations always sort of happen in little spurts, right? And so I think we had the beginnings of this over the last 5 years or so. And I'm seeing a really interesting transition happening from postmortem sort of being written and filed away to postmortems ending up on Hacker News right away. And I imagine there's an increasing desire within companies to get those postmortems published, sort of more officially from themselves to those public social channels more quickly. And I think that's kind of the next stage of this progression is, how do we start to track these things across companies? How do we, where do we all go? Right now, it's a list of websites, right? We go to the NASA website, we go to like Cloudflare's website, we hit Hacker News, maybe there's a Reddit subreddit. So I really think that's kind of the next change that we're sort of looking for is where does this community grow in terms of that general acceptance. And once that happens, you then get sort of orders of magnitude propagation, right, out across the technical communities of acceptance. And there's a desire to do this more often because your company isn't really operating if you're not also publishing your learnings, right? Like Stack Overflow kind of got us there from a social standpoint, right? You sort of can build up karma from the perspective of like producing learnings and sharing them around as an individual. I don't really think there's an equivalent yet for companies, and there probably needs to be.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting too. It makes me think about what we could learn from maybe the security industry, how like a lot of companies will work together, have, groups where they come together to talk about recent vulnerabilities. And then they also like report on vulnerabilities. So you can just see like an RSS feed or join a mailing list to see everything that's happening. Do you think maybe we could learn from the security engineering space for just broader incidents as a whole?
I do, and I think I sort of knocked on the medical industry a little bit in that talk, but the medical industry has been doing the true version of postmortems, actually after death types of research in their conferences for decades, where when there is a life lost, they'll have conferences where all of the specialists will come together and they'll actually do a general wide scale review of why is that working? Why is that not like, why didn't that work? What didn't you do right? What should we change about best practices? And I think that practice really could propagate out from the security industry as it has sort of propagated up from them out to the wider industry so that we have more of these shared learnings instead of siloed knowledge inside of companies. I would love to see, more FailCon style conferences that focus on that. The startup industry has done this forever, where when startups kind of go under, there's been a series of conferences that have been come together, talk about why it didn't work, and that community learns from it. I think similarly, we can learn from that, across organizations within companies and probably actually more effectively.
That's definitely awesome. Sounds like a great future, maybe QCon workshop as well.
I would love to be involved in additional future conversations and meetings where we're just digging deeply into major outages that have happened at companies. I think that it would be one of the most fascinating topics to have recordings for and distribution for in a central repository.
Definitely. It sounds awesome. I really like that idea a lot. I've never seen that before, but I would definitely be one of the first to sign up to come along. So another question that came through is, what's your suggestion on a template for postmortem? So I know you've got to think about this a lot, right? Working at Kintaba, creating Kintaba as a company after working at Facebook. So yeah, like what did you really take away from that to say, this is what we really need to have?
Yeah, I struggle a lot with that question because it's turned out that the adoption within a company of a single postmortem is actually a little bit antithetical to the idea of trying to increase the number of incidents filed, because the template for your postmortem defines, right, the end state that people are going to get in after they have an incident, and that influences whether or not you're willing to file the incident, right? And so where we're going inside of Kintaba, and we're not there yet, we're a young company, but where we're trying to run towards is this idea of multiple types of templates that go everywhere from as simple as a one sentence, what did we learn here? Where you would make up for the fact that maybe you're not walking in a hallway anymore in remote work, and you don't get to walk past the person who was involved, and they say, "Wow, never roll Kubernetes that way again," right? All the way out to the much more complex templates, which are from folks like Google that they've published, and I can drop a link into the chat, but there's a pretty decent Google postmortem template on their SRE public SRE book that digs into the way they do it, which focuses really heavily on what happened, where was our root cause, what went wrong, what went well, and then critically, where did we get lucky? Which is a really important section that I think a lot of folks will occasionally overlook inside of postmortems, which talks a lot about this wasn't our process working, right? This was like something just happened to work out. And where we got lucky is a super important section, especially for more complex incidents, because it's easy to overlook those things as that was working versus that just happened to work out. And it's critical to go through that section when you're trying to remediate into your processes to make sure you're more resilient long term, to be able to say, okay, we got lucky here, here, and here. Let's codify that stuff so we don't have to rely on luck happening again.
Yes,
so I think in terms of templates, that would be great. Definitely that Google template. Internal to your company, you also should really track readership of postmortems and see the ones that get read the most. In a lot of ways, writing postmortems and knowledge distribution is like an SEO problem. It's like, how do we go internally and get people excited about this stuff and reading, and then model your future postmortems after the ones that do get read, after the ones that are written well. Because you have an audience that's not necessarily mapped to everyone else's audience. Your audience in your company, if you're primarily a small SaaS business selling to a couple of major enterprises, is going to look very different than the Google major scale tech postmortem.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess we have only 1 minute left. So do you have top 3 tips for how to write a postmortem that people want to read that you could share with us?
Yeah, so it's like writing a newspaper article is the way that I think about it, right? Lead with the important data, because people might only read that first sentence. Lead with the most important takeaway in that first sentence. Make sure you include a section about what you learned as the person with the most context. It's a critical part of writing an incident report, is you're the only one who was there. Everyone from the outside is going to have a different set of hindsight context into the incident. And so if all you do is get like primary learning number 1 into the first sentence, and then what unique perspective you had as the participant in it in your second section, I think you'll actually get like 70-80% out of what most people get out of postmortems.
Thank you so much, John. So we've reached the allotted time for your session. Thank you for joining us. And we invite everybody to join you in the Hangout with the speaker, which will be in the Zoom room. So this is an informal opportunity to ask questions and share your thoughts. So please turn your camera on to chat and ask questions in there. And a link can be found in the chat window. So thank you again so much, John, and for everyone for attending.